Good morning, everyone. I'm going to give it another minute or so, just waiting for Sophia to join. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I see that we have at least one of our speakers in the meeting, so welcome everyone. We have to start, unfortunately, by revising this very first slide on the agenda because I didn't update it. But we have on the agenda an AOB that I'm allocating 15 minutes to, not 5. So we're going to reduce the time on the 2 drafts by 5 minutes each. Sophia, welcome. Okay, so first, if I could ask, we don't actually have anyone in Vienna from neither of Sophia and I are there. So we see a very sad empty chair. There are a few people in the audience. So in the mic, the mic line is actually rather far away. So if there could just be a little mindfulness in the room, help us. Thanks, Meet Echo folks. Now we can see the mic line better. So if there are folks that need to speak, you just walk up to the queue and we can call on you from there. Also, if I could ask if there's anyone willing to take notes for us, I think Sophia may be able to do that, but she would like some help as well. I'm waiting for some confirmation in the chat. Thanks, Kirshvad. Great. And let's go ahead and get started then. So first, I just want to warmly welcome Sophia as the co-chair of HRPC now. Sophia, are you able to come off camera? If not, that's fine. But
yes.
Great.
Great.
Wonderful. So very glad you're here. Do you want to say a few things?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mallory. I'm very excited about this, and we're working with all together to create amazing drafts proposals. So very happy for this work as well. And thank you very much, Mallory.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to Colin, who worked hard to get you onboarded. So we're really appreciative of that effort as well. And it's really nice as well to have a balance. So we have you coming from private sector as Cloudflare, and then the civil society balance is good. So with that, we will just go through the usual welcoming slides. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the HRPC history because we have some new folks joining us today. But first, obviously, the note well. This is the slide that explains the intellectual property piece. You've probably all seen this many times already. I separated out specifically the privacy and code of conduct piece because that's really important as well for this meeting. In the IRTF, which is where this research group is situated, we're really focused on the long-term research issues related to the internet. And of course, we're trying our best to conduct research. We're not developing standards, trying our best to conduct good research. We're not developing standards, and also to that end, our documents are informational. So then HRPC was chartered in order to look at the human rights as it's explained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and ICCPR. So specifically, we call out in our charter to human rights the right to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, although there are others, including the right to privacy, which is more aligned with the privacy enhancements and assessments research group. So there's definitely some overlap and collaboration between the two research groups, but we do not focus specifically on that human right. We are trying to provide guidelines to those working in the IETF and on protocols. So one of our current documents does that very well. And then there is just the raising awareness of the issues in this community of human rights. We do that through bringing in speakers to our sessions, and we're excited for those talks today, which I'll go over when I go back to the agenda slide. So far, we do have an RFC 8280. Our other internet drafts have covered a variety of topics, some that are no longer active, but are really looking at the overlaps between the human rights space and the protocol development space. There have been others as well that have presented at HRPC or who have started work here that are publishing elsewhere. So they're taking their work and their papers into academic journals and academic conferences. So recognizing that that is actually an explicit goal of HRPC is to have publications go elsewhere, not just in the RFC series. There's actually a film that was done. So it's an interesting opportunity for us to think about other media that might reach some of these goals for us. You can watch the film on hrpc.io that was launched some years back. And we've also talked a lot about data and visualization through Big Bang and other things. I think Sebastian presented at last session on Big Bang and how to do analysis of mailing lists and things like that. So again, really fits in with our research. And then against, I think, some of the guidelines and suggestions we make about the relationship between human rights and protocols, others have been able to take that guidance and actually review other work in the IETF and elsewhere. So I've probably gone through a lot of this, but our charter was from 2015. The RFC 8280s from 2017. And then here's the current state. So actually, the only two that are active on this list are guidelines and freedom of association. The feminism and protocols and the political draft are inactive, but I put them on there because I do think that there are folks interested in that work. It just hasn't progressed recently. So let me slide all the way back to the agenda. So after that intro, we're actually really good on time now, which is great. So just checking to see if John is here, because if not, we can always have.
I'm here.
Oh, great. John, welcome. So you should be able to present. Yeah, okay, good. So I will welcome you and go off camera while you present.
Thank you. So I guess you can see my slides. Yeah. So this is an update of the presentation I held in 2019 here in HRPC about privacy and surveillance and security in 5G. This is an update to that presentation, talking about what was actually done, what was not done, and the new things, consequences of that, and new things that had happened since then. First, a little bit about 3GPP. So as you know, 3GPP operates in this 10 years generations, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, 6G. A little bit less known is that 3GPP also works in 5-year half releases of these. GPRS and HSPA are maybe the most known. And then 3GPP works in these 1 to 2 year releases. Currently, 3GPP are working on release 17 and 18 in parallel. And right now, I think 2G to 5G are still active and in use. 2G and 3G will be, in just a few years, it will be shut down in most places of the world, around 2025. I think at least in Africa, in Asia, Europe, and America, North America, it will be shut down by then in almost all countries. African countries are still planning to use 2G, 3G for maybe a decade more or so. So one of the things I talked about 2019 was the battle against IMSI catchers and false base stations. And I'm happy to report that basically everything I said was planned at that time actually happened. Everything was approved, at least in the standards. Then how much it's actually used in practice, for example, detection of false base station, that's harder to answer. So is this an end to the battle against false base station? Well, maybe long term, but there are some things that are still not perfect. I think this slide summarizes all of them. One thing is that so in 5G, the IMSI, which is the identifier for the subscriber, it's encrypted when you send it over the air. But this is mandatory to support, but optional to use. Optional security is not really considered best practice anymore, but 3GPP really like to make things optional to use. Even given that, my understanding is that this will be turned on and used in large parts of the world, but I don't have any exact details of where and when. If you want to know more, I think contact your home operator or operators in general. If your home operator supports this, your IMSI will be encrypted even when you are roaming globally. Another limitation is that the identifier IMSI consists of a country code, a network code, and a subscriber identification number. And the encryption only encrypts the subscriber identification number. Similar if you use an I, which is a possibility in 3GPP, only the username is encrypted and the realm is sent in clear text. So potentially when you're roaming, you can track and identify users by looking at the country code, network code, or by looking at the realm. And this is very similar to IETF standards as EAP, where you also send the realm in clear text. There might be more of a problem in 3GPP where roaming is very common. This is, however, harder problem to solve. 3GPP discussed this a couple of years ago, but did not agree on any trade-off. Might be discussed more in the future. I think more academic research on this, both on the problems and potential solutions, would be welcome. Another problem is legacy interop. So even if this is encrypted in 5G, it's not encrypted in earlier standards. 5G introduces new protections. So a false base station or a stingray cannot trick a phone to downgrade to, for example, 2G, 3G, or 4G. But when you turn on your phone, if the only thing you see is a 2G fake base station, your phone will connect to that. And similar, you could theoretically jam, for example, 5G frequencies or not. But I don't think we have seen that in practice anywhere. That's complicated. Android 12 is introducing a 2G, or have introduced a 2G kill switch. You can turn off 2G. I think this is great news. I've personally been requesting this for a long time. I think if you have any other phones, like an older Android or an Apple, you're unfortunately out of luck. One recent example of mobile identity tracking was in the war in Ukraine, where allegedly, this is just media information, Russian troops were tracking British mobile identities to do artillery strikes. Unclear how this was done, could have been done by hacking the mobile networks, but theoretically, you could do this even in 5G by just eavesdropping on the country code and mobile network code over the air. And then you can see where these, and then with triangulation, you could see where these phones are. 3D-PPS also started some new studies. There's an ongoing release 18 study. It just started, so there's not much content in that study yet. And by the way, you can find references to a lot of information at the end of this presentation. So 3D-PP has a lot of other identities than SUPI. Most of these are temporary. There's also a lot of parameters in this. This study was started by the academic paper NORI, Concealing the Concealed Identifier in 5G, written by me and a colleague, which identifies that the variable length NICE leak information with the current encryption. There's no padding. This will be one of the things the study looks at, but it will take a broad approach looking at all the identifiers and parameters, looking what an attacker can do by combining different identifiers or combining identifiers with things like location or time, and how the attacker in question is supposed to use artificial intelligence or machine learning. So I think this is a very good study. Hopefully there will be, even if everything might not be fixed now, it will be stored and fixed later in 60. The industry has already started to look at what 6G will be like, and one of the study items that we are studying right now is to look at identifiers in the core network. Haven't really gotten very far in this, but the aim of the study is to take a broad look at all the identifiers and see if there's any privacy sensitive information that doesn't really need to be there. The plan for 6G, at least Ericsson's plan, is that privacy sensitive information is sent on a as needed basis and then deleted when it's not needed. Another thing I talked about in 2019 was zero trust architecture inside and between networks. And I can happily report that this also, basically everything was approved, at least inside the networks. So there is TLS 1.3 between all the nodes in this SPA architecture. What to exactly use between the networks, which has been a major weakness in the past with this SS7 attacks and so on, it's still a bit unclear. This JSON interface that was standardized seems to be a little bit complex to actually deploy, so it might be replaced with something simpler like plain TLS tunnels, but that's still a bit under discussion in GSMA. So there is several SDUs involved in standardization of mobile networks. Third thing, also this that I presented in 2019, and go back to the 2019 presentation if you want more information about what I discussed then. So the problem here was that in the Snowden revelations, it was allegedly US and UK intelligence hacked the SIM manufacturer Gemalto and stole a lot of the keys. We don't know if that's really happen, but I guess we can assume that it did. It doesn't really matter. It's just that the possibility that it happened and they got millions or billions of keys is bad enough. There's also the possibilities that there's collaboration between vendors and intelligence. So this was Ericsson was proposing here that to introduce Diffie-Hellman to get so-called forward secrecy. This was unfortunately declined. And to summarize what you can do with this, this was called this great SIM heist in media. Extension of its usual is not very known, but the potential is a disaster. According to media, potentially billions of secret keys were compromised. What you can do with these keys is that you can impersonate the mobile phone, you can impersonate the network, you can passively eavesdrop on all information and you can track users. You can also connect users to a false base station and inject malware. All things discussed in media and all theoretically true. Ericsson proposed to study this. Existing authentication procedure lacking PFS property was the name of this suggested study. Unfortunately, just to study this topic was objected by companies from France, UK, and US. There was also strong support from Swedish, Finnish, Chinese, German, and US companies. There were not really any technical reason given. I would not like to speculate in why these companies objected to study this. I think you have to ask them yourself. But this is a very current situation is very bad, and I think any highlighting and discussion and making this public, all discussion on this topic is good, I think. Situation right now, to use the words from Keith Martin, is that there is no authentication method in public 5G with acceptable security norms. Ericsson is currently driving the aka PFS standard in IETF EMU, but this is currently only approved for use in private networks. We'll discuss a little bit what that is later. So the access authentication in 5G is called primary authentication. 5G networks comes in two different flavors. There are public 5G networks. These are the mobile networks that you all know and use every day. These are the public ones where you can, as a private person, can sign up to. 5G introduced also what is called private 5G networks. These are meant for use by single organizations like industries or verticals. They can be completely standalone, like the industry is operating them without the help of a mobile operator, or there can be various degrees of interaction between an industry and the current mobile operator. Another thing pointing out is that the normal authentication in 5G is a USIM containing a pre-shared key. And in media, you often see the term SIM card. This is not really accurate. USIM is an application, and it can be reside on a removable UICC. This is what is typically referred to as a SIM card. It can also be on an embedded UICC. This is a little chip that exists in most modern phones. And recently, it has also been approved that it can be implemented in a trusted execution environment, like inside the CPU of the phone. And these are all the authentication methods that can be used in 5G. And as you can see, the ones for public networks are not really following best practice. Also, the current IETF authentication methods, like ETLS 2 is better, but it's not really good. EAP TLS 103 was standardized just a few weeks ago by IETF. It's already implemented, and with that and EAP TTLS 103, which will hopefully be standardized later this year, then you get best practice security and privacy, meaning client identity protection and forward secrecy. Forward secrecy, I would say, is also a must for so-called zero trust. So a little bit more about why you want to use Diffie-Hellman and why forward secrecy itself is not really enough. So there has been a lot of discussion about forward secrecy in IETF in recent years. Forward secrecy protects your keys from compromise in one direction. So if your key are compromised at time T2 here, the attacker cannot compromise any previous keys. On the other hand, the attacker can compromise all future keys. This is a good start, but it's not really as good as we can do. If you frequently do Diffie-Hellman, like every hour or so, then you get much better protection. Then you get protection from a passive attacker also in the future. As you can see here, you have an attack at T2 in this second picture here, and all your previous and future keys are secure against a passive attacker. Using terminology from the excellent RFC 7625, forward secrecy. If you have forward secrecy, an attacker can still do static key exfiltration. That means that they get the key once and then they can use it for forever in the future. They don't need to extract any new keys. Doing frequent Diffie-Hellman every hour or so forces an attacker to do dynamic key exfiltration or content exfiltration. And I would say that forcing an attacker to do this should definitely be considered best practice. The reason for this is that this increases the risk for the attacker to be detected much more. They need to be active frequently, like every hour or so. This RFC 7625, read that. It's an excellent piece of document. Unfortunately, it has not been used very much in IETFs or reference since it was published. Another thing why you want to do frequent Diffie-Hellman is to align with zero trust principles. Assuming breach, like key exfiltration, is an essential part of zero trust. Summarized by these two statements here, zero trust assumes that breach is inviolable or likely already has happened. This is a statement from NSA. And then from some company, if breach occurs, minimize the impact of breach. And this, I would interpret this as forward secrecy is absolutely a baseline requirement, and frequent Diffie-Hellman is probably what you need to do to align with zero trust principles. French government has had this as a requirement from 2015 for IPsec. And they require Diffie-Hellman every hour or every 100 gigabytes. I would say this should be considered best practice for when possible. For constrained IoT, this is not really possible. But IPsec is not really special. This should apply in general. If you're using the signal protocol, this is achieved by the double ratchet algorithm. That is not really doing ephemeral Diffie-Hellman. It's doing something called ephemeral static Diffie-Hellman, but it's doing them in different direction frequently and basically achieves the same thing. So how is TLS 103 doing in this aspect? Actually, not so good, I would say. TLS 103 standardizes this PSK key exchange method, and they made it look like recommended. It's actually recommended to implement and not use, but that's very unclear. 3GPP, I have forbidden everything without forward secrecy in for TLS 1.2, and with the introduction of TLS 1.3, this unfortunately got into 3GPP specs again, and when I tried to forbid it, I got the reply from some company that we should not remove this because it's recommended by the IETF. These things, this might see like a small technical editorial thing, but it has great practical impact. I think IETF needs to be much better as marking everything that is weak as not recommended. I think IETF sometimes care way too much about companies caring about their what they have implemented, even if, and don't want it to be not recommended, even if it's apparently is all facts points to it being very weak. TLS 1.2, the updated TLS document will have some consideration regarding frequent use of Diffie-Hellman. I just got a PR approved there. The point with TLS 1.3 is that importantly you still need quite a strict profiling to make it secure. TLS 1.3, for example, forbids the PSK key exchange and also forbids cipher suits without confidentiality. So TLS also removes the possibility to do frequent Diffie-Hellman inside a connection. If you want this in TLS 1.3, you need to set up new connections. That might be simple in some web applications, but in some other cases it can be very, very hard. One example of this is DTLS over SCTP in 3GPP, where setting up a new connection would mean to disconnect the cell tower for a long time. All the phones connected to a cell tower losing connection, which is like not possible to do. This leads to the DTLS SCTP specification needing a complete rewrite. I would not be surprised if there are more cases where setting up a connection is very problematic. I think we will see in the future. A new thing that is coming in 5G that I did not talk about last time is authenticated encryption in the user plane. So 2G only used unauthentic encryption, so encryption without any integrity protection, no authentication tag at the end. 3G and 4G introduced authenticated encryption for the control plane. So 3GPP standards had two different planes. It's a user plane where all your, if you're web browsing, it sends in the user plane, but all the control messages are sent in another plane. 5G release 16, you have authenticated encryption also for the user plane. And this is not only needed to get integrity protection, authenticated encryption is also used to get best practice confidentiality and protect against shoes and ciphertext attacks. But on the user plane, most of the information here is already encrypted at the application level using, for example, HTTPS or transport layer. Here's an overview of the algorithms used in 3GPP. All the weak algorithms, there's been a lot of media attention about the algorithms in 3GPP, at least previously. All the weak algorithms are from the 2G generation. And everything from 3G and on is, I would say, is strong and secure. And 3GPP and Etsy Sage are working on new 256 high-performance software-friendly algorithms for 5G, later 5G releases and 6G. 3GPP is also looking at user consent. It's also something that happens since 2019. And this is inspired by the European GDPR law and other similar privacy laws around the globe that has very strict requirements on user consent for processing or storing personal data. Some applications in 5G use, of course, use the data to do different things, such as optimizing the networks or some location services and so on. 3GPP has studied this in TR 33/867. It studies consent in general to raise awareness among the operators, also gives concrete recommendations in some use cases. And the overall conclusion in 5G in 3GPP is that user consent should be stored with the subscription data. This means that any consent is given for the subscription, and then anybody using that subscription. You could also think of other thing where, for example, this cookie law. When I'm browsing the web at least in Europe, I need to accept cookie pop-ups all the time. I can say I don't really read them. I just try to click them away. So I don't think that's a very good model either. But of course, there's trade-offs here. And then you have a lot of references. I think that was a little bit less than 30 minutes. So hopefully we have time for some questions, if there are.
Go ahead, Nancy.
Hello, thanks so much for this excellent presentation. Could you let us know on which 3GPP mailing list the discussion on PFS takes place? Because there are many and not all are easy to follow. So could you perhaps point out what are the best lists to follow these discussions?
Yeah, so any discussion here was done on the SA3 mailing list. I can send out, you need to be a member of 3GPP to subscribe to the list, but the mail archive is open and public. I can send out the link to the Hrpc email list to the mail archive. Then some things are, of course, discussed during the meetings. At least before Corona, they were discussed in face-to-face meetings. The meetings are not recorded, and sometimes the minutes are a bit limited. For the PFS discussion, Ericsson was asking for a raise of hand to note which company objected to introducing PFS, so that you can find exact companies that was supportive and objective to this. You can find in the meeting minutes that there is a reference to in the presentation.
Thanks so much for that answer, and I would really appreciate those resources. And thanks again for that overview. Could you elaborate perhaps a bit more on privacy, but also other human rights implications of private 5G networks, as well as edge computing in 5G networks?
Yeah, private 5G networks will only be used for industries. I don't think there is so many, and most of these the devices in these networks will probably be Internet of Things devices. So I don't think it will have so much human rights implications, and I think the use cases will vary very, very much depending on industry. So I think if there are any implications, you need to look at each industry as a special case. Don't remember. There was some other question.
The implications of edge computing.
Edge computing. It will of course be more. There will be some information available in the edge in more places, but I think with modern technology, these are also more protected on a hardware level. one discussion is at least to use trusted enclaves for edge computing, but what will actually be deployed in practice and when, I don't know. But I think the risk is that more information is spread in more nodes, but I think it can be done in a secure way.
Thanks so much. This was really useful. If no one else is in the queue, may I ask a follow-up question? Oh, there is someone in the queue, so I stop hogging the mic. Sorry.
Thank you. The way I understand it, there is a lot of slack in the definition of 5G with some security and privacy features that can be deployed or not. Is there a worldwide survey of what is the actual state of the deployment of these techniques? I mean, how many, for instance, are still really using the poor algorithm and things like that?
Which algorithm did you say?
You mentioned that it's still possible to use poor encryption algorithm in 5G, that they're still authorized. But my question was, do we have an idea how common it is to have this algorithm?
No, I think that algorithm is not so common, but I don't think there's any public resources that say which operators globally is using or not using what. I think that such a resource would be very good. It would be great if somebody made such a website and actually did that research. I think, of course, some of the vendors might have some information, but it's a bit limited. We know who we have sold to, but we might not know if the operator turn it on or not. I think GSMA might have some service, but not. I don't think GSMA has the broad understanding of exactly. Maybe for specific topic they might do some internal service and so on, but these are typically not public either. I don't think they sit with all the information. But for example, one thing that would be interesting right now is that which operators has implemented and turned on this Suki encryption of the IMSI. That would be maybe a starting point. There are some researchers doing some research in like encryption algorithms and so on, but it's often a bit specific and it quite quickly gets old. If it's a 10-year-old or 5-year-old paper, it's not really up to date anymore.
Okay, I see.
Great. I just had a question, and then I think we'll move on to the next speaker. But you had mentioned that you've proposed some changes in TLS. Are there other places in the IETF, any working groups where you're sort of actively following discussion, or others who are interested in this work could also subscribe to lists and follow work?
I think it needs to be I think the good security and privacy affect all IETF groups. I think IETF has had, at least in TLS, there's maybe been a bit too much focus on forward secrecy and some idea that will solve everything. I think TLS removed the possibility to do frequent Diffie-Hellman just when that started to become best practice in the rest of the world. But it might also be a little bit, TLS is maybe a bit too web focused and don't always understand where it's used in other places. But that's also 3GPP started using TLS much more for long-term connections at the same time as TLS was developed. So we should maybe have been active then. It might be possible. It's a little bit unfortunate, but you can solve it by setting up new connections. And if I think TLS is maybe one of the in a good position. I think the problem is more when security is used in other groups. I think there needs to be a constant focus to improve privacy and security everywhere. IETF is maybe doing the best of all SDOs, but there's still a lot of weaknesses in IETF protocols that should be worked on.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, John, for joining us today. I encourage others to reach out if there are other questions. It was just a very useful overview of where that standard is at from privacy
Thank you.
perspective.
Feel free to contact me if you want any discussion or information about 5G networks and so on, yeah, and privacy.
Fantastic. Thanks again. So yes, checking our agenda, as folks had noted before, it has changed actually. So the items 4 and 5 only have 15 minutes for the drafts, and we'll have 15 minutes then under AOB for Lenny to present on the IP blocking draft. Next up then is Jacobo from Witness, who is going to be talking about content provenance. And so go ahead, Jacobo, there is a button that looks like a document on the top that you can click, and then your slides should be available to you to load.
Yeah, here they are. All right, share.
Brilliant. Well done. The floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, everyone, afternoon. So first, just quickly apologize if you see me grappling for air. I'm in Quito, Ecuador for the first time in a couple of years, and the air is very thin here. We're almost at 3,000 meters above the sea level. So my name is Jacobo Castellanos, and I work with Witness in the Technology Threats and Opportunities Program. For context, Witness is a human rights organization that works with activists, citizen journalists, human rights defenders that use video and technology in crisis and conflict situations. So for today, I'd like to talk to you about the harms modeling work that we've done within the C2PA, so the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. A quick caveat also before starting, Witness is not an organization that works normally within standard development organizations. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak here and get any thoughts or comments that you may have. Our work in the C2PA, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, is just really informed by our previous work in content provenance and authenticity. Let me. Here it is. So for today, I want to cover 3 topics as long as time permits. So first, just a quick background on Witness and our work on provenance and authenticity infrastructure. The second is an overview of the C2PA and the specs. And then the third thing, and the bulk of the time, on the harms modeling work that's happened within the C2PA. So just to start off on the same page, I wanted to offer this general definition of provenance and authenticity infrastructure, which is, it refers to the tools, the services, or the frameworks that facilitate capturing, processing, and presenting information about the source and the history of digital assets in a way that is verifiable and tamper evident. So here we have an image that comes from the C2PA, but it's illustrative of the broader provenance and authenticity ecosystem, I think. So we have here an image with its metadata and background information about the source of this image, the history, if the size of the image was changed or if the colors were altered, for example. This provenance information, this provenance and authenticity infrastructure refers to the tools that allow capturing this information and processing it. So a quick overview on Witness. So Witness has been part of this work for a number of years now. It's in many ways been pioneered by human rights organizations. So Witness worked with the Guardian Project on proof mode, which is an application that creates signed visual evidence with images and videos. We've also researched and drafted this report, the TICS or It Didn't Happen report, that pinpoints to 14 key issues that should be addressed at an early stage, which is where we still are now when thinking about provenance and authenticity infrastructure, instead of trying to deal with at a later stage once this has been deployed and perhaps be more widely used. So just to mention a couple of the things that have come out of this previous work, Witness has been advocating for provenance and authenticity infrastructure to always be opt-in, recognizing that there are reasons, there are legitimate reasons for people not to want or not to be able to use these tools. Also thinking about privacy, Witness has been thinking or advocating for mechanisms of redaction of information. So once this provenance and authenticity trail of information is created, what are the mechanisms by which information could be redacted and or sensitive information be protected? So based on this work and also previous work with Adobe's content authenticity initiative, Witness made the decision of being part of this of the C2PA, this coalition. I think the next slide talks about the coalition. No, not yet, but I'll explain. I'll introduce the coalition in a second. So one of the things that we have been seeing is that this provenance and authenticity infrastructure is moving from niche tools, again, that have been primarily pioneered by human rights organizations, and it's starting to become more systematic efforts are starting to appear, and these are led by the C2PA, this coalition, but also Content Authenticity Initiative, Project Origin, which focuses on news media, and it's been led by larger companies such as Adobe, Microsoft, BBC, Hrpc, amongst others. And so as we have been seeing this this shift from niche tools to more systematic use, so Witness has been asking, so as we see this shift, how do we prevent, how do we avert and mitigate harms? And how do we enhance freedom of expression and trust? And so this takes me to the C2PA. So the coalition, again, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity is this group of companies primarily that have come together to create these technical specifications that are meant to create this interoperable ecosystem of capturing and processing authentication and provenance information. So the C2PA is led by the companies that are listed here: Adobe, ARM, BBC, Intel, Microsoft, Hrpc, Twitter, now also Sony. But there are over a dozen other general and contributing members, and Witness is one of these contributing members. As of January 26th of this year, version 1.0 of these specifications have been published. We are now heading in the coming, soon in the coming weeks, perhaps, going into version 1.0 of these specifications. And so we're moving past the design stage and now into the implementation and the development of these tools. So here I have a very quick overview of the design of the specs. This overview will by no means do it justice, but hopefully it'll give a very general picture, at least enough to go into the next part of the conversation, which is the harms modeling. So the way that these specs have been designed, and I'm going to be using C2PA terminology here, there are three actors in this example, in this hypothetical example. Three actors are doing three different actions with three different C2PA enabled tools. So here we have actor one that takes a picture, say with a Nikon camera. The moment that this picture is taken, a manifest is created, as it is called in the C2PA. I don't know if you can see my cursor when I think not, but I'm pointing at the first column. So this manifest includes certain metadata or assertions, which in this case could include information about the location where the image was taken or the date that it was taken. This information is cryptographically hashed to the image and then signed here by the signer, which could be Nikon or a third-party service. And just getting a little bit ahead of myself here, the trust model, or the way that the C2PA promotes trust, is really tied to this signer right here. The signer is a notary of sorts that vouches for the information that is included here. The signer, it could be said that it's more than that, really, because the signer determines what information is included in these manifests and what information is not included, for that matter. So let's say we go to action 2. This picture now has been taken. It includes a manifest. It goes to actor 2. Actor 2 is going to edit this image on Photoshop. The editor might change the color of the image or the size of the image, thereby creating another manifest right here. So like another little rectangle. This information is cryptographically hashed to the image again and signed. In this case, it would be signed probably by Adobe, which is one of the steering committee members in these efforts. And then the third actor might publish it in the New York Times. The editor here, the publisher might compress the image, add captions. This creates another manifest, again, cryptographically hashed and signed. Here, the signer could actually determine if all the manifests are included or just one. But the point of this all is so that once it gets to the consumer, the image or the video or the digital assets gets to the consumer, ideally, they would be able to look at all of this provenance information, and with that additional information, be able to have a better sense of whether or not they will trust this image or they will decide to believe in it. Before going past this quick summary, I'll just highlight that the C2PA is not intended to determine what is true and what is not true. As it's established, it merely gives this verifiable information, additional verifiable provenance information, so that consumers, users could make more informed decisions about what they're consuming. So with that quick overview, I want to skip to witnesses' involvement in this and how we've been thinking about bolstering a human rights framework around these specs. We've had two main objectives, I think it would be fair to say, within the C2PA. So for one thing, we have been looking at the design of the specs and thinking about the potential harms and how they could be prevented, how they could be averted, how we could mitigate harms. And on the other hand, we also see the authenticity and provenance infrastructure bringing a lot of opportunities from our perspective, to human rights defenders, to activists, to journalists. How could this help create more trustworthy content? How could, for example, human rights defenders use this infrastructure to create visual evidence of human rights violations? So how do we foster these usages? So Witness being a general and contributing member of the C2PA, we work mostly under the technical working group, so the bottom purple box. In the technical working group is where these specs are being designed, and Witness is the co-chair of the Threats and Harms Task Force, where we have been leading the harms modeling efforts that I'll get to in a second. However, considering the broader objectives that we have also been informing the steering committee on various issues. So perhaps most importantly, at least at the start, by establishing the guiding principles of the C2PA. And I have another slide just to talk about the guiding principles, because it really has set the foundations for the work on harms modeling. But beyond that, also we've been having conversations on how to continue a harms assessment beyond the design stage or before 1.0 and on to the next stages of the specifications. And then also more broadly, again, thinking about how we promote critical usages. We've been having conversations about resourcing and supporting the creation of tools that are directly focused on human rights defenders, journalists, amongst others. So, as I mentioned, the guiding principles really have been the foundation for the work that we have been doing. As mentioned, we have not been working within standards development organizations, so it's been unclear to us how, at least from the start, it's been an evolution for us and a growth curve. But by having established these guiding principles from the start, or having advocated for these guiding principles from the start, it has really paved the way for the harms modeling work. So when the C2PA was created, Witness was advocating, along with other companies, to really think about privacy concerns. So based on the report that I mentioned at the start, for example, we were really advocating for there to be redaction mechanisms. We were also thinking, advocating for the specs to be designed thinking about global audiences. So how could the specs be useful and pertinent and avert harm, not just in normally in Europe or the United States, but how it could be relevant in marginalized communities in Africa or Latin America. How we could make sure that it be simple and not a cost burden. And then perhaps most importantly, that one of the principles be that the standard, the specifications be assessed for their capacity to result in harm or for their capacity to be misused or abused. So I've numbered here a couple of principles. I'll just read the first one. C2PA specifications must respect the common privacy concerns of each of the target users. Onto the second point, the second subpoint, C2PA specifications must allow content creators, editors, and publishers to remove sensitive information before sharing with others, and subsequent participants must be made aware of such removal. C2PA specifications must not require identity of the person or organization making any assertion or claim about an asset to be documented. The specifications may allow that information to be represented, provided that representation is optional. So here, there's a list of other guiding principles as I was highlighting in this box. But here, the second point, I just want to emphasize on this point that, again, thinking about privacy that manifests never, at least not as at the standards level, require individual identifiers to be connected to manifests. So based on these guiding principles, as was mentioned, Witness has been leading this harms modeling efforts, which really has revolved around a harms, misuse, and abuse assessment that I'll explain the process in the next slides. So there's been really three areas of work or phases, if you will, though they have been iterative. So on the one hand, and this has been connected to the work with the TWG, with the technical working group, and not just the threats and harms task forces, well, thinking about the purpose of this infrastructure, what are the use cases, who are the users, and also very importantly, who are the stakeholders. So with that foundation, we went on to think about the assessment, right? So what are the actual or the potential harms that could result from these specifications and this systematic use of provenance and authenticity infrastructure. And here I'll just mention that this assessment was very much inspired, or it was adapted from Microsoft's harms modeling framework. So a taxonomy that frames the thinking around identifying potential harms. And then the third area, very importantly, is thinking about mitigation strategies. So once we've identified these potential harms, how we think these could be addressed. There's two elements to this work that are very important to highlight. First of all, that it's ongoing, and this is something that we've been repeating at different instances, that it's important that it start at the design stage. It gives us a head start when thinking about human rights issues, but it has to be continuous, especially now that it goes into beyond 1.0, because it's starting to be implemented and tools are starting to be created, and we're going past the realm of potential harms to actual harms. So it has to be continuous. And then the second is that the assessment has to include multidisciplinary and diverse range of stakeholders. It's really important to think about how this could impact stakeholders and get a sense and get them in being involved in these conversations to get a better sense of what the implications may be. Yeah, so I'll just explain this a little bit further. So there's two areas where we've been having these discussions. So on the one hand, within the C2PA, within the technical working group and the threats and harms task force, where, as you may imagine, there's a group of experts, mainly coming from tech companies and news media organizations that offer their expertise and insight to get a sense of what the human rights implications are, but also recognizing the limitations of this group, the lack of representation, and also the understanding of broader societal issues. Witness began an outreach process, reaching out to as many folks as possible from different parts of the world, with different lived, technical, professional experiences, in order to get a sense of how they thought that this infrastructure could affect them, how it could help them, and based on these conversations, identify these harms and the potential mitigations. So this is an overview of the results. In the next slide, I'll mention a couple of examples, but to get an idea, again, and this is an adapted version of Microsoft's harms modeling framework, the potential harms identified, which is just under 60, there's different types of harms that have been identified, not just because they fit under different categories, but because some are very specific to the impact that the C2PA could have. Others are more general about potential harms that could come from provenance and authenticity infrastructure, starting with the fact that it's a data capturing system at the end of the day. And then there are other harms that may not be directly connected to provenance and authenticity infrastructure or the C2PA, that they may not be a result of this, but that they may be worsened, or the issue may be deepened by a more systematic use of this infrastructure. So there's been 4 categories of harms identified. So for one, denial of consequential services. So we looked at the losses of opportunities, how people could lose opportunities. What are the economic losses that people could have coming out of the standards? What are the infringements on human rights? So how it could affect people's dignity, their liberty, how it could affect their privacy or their constraints on freedom of expression, freedom of association, and environmental impact. Would there be an erosion of social and democratic structures? Would there be manipulation? Here we saw questions around mis and disinformation. Could there be an over-reliance on technical systems or any other social detriment? And then lastly, risk of injury, so emotional or psychological distress or physical harm. So the number that accompanies each one of these refers to the potential harms identified. I'll mention a couple of examples here in the next slide. So one of the things that could come out of the C2PA, and we recognize that these are only technical specifications yet. Once you go into the tooling, this harms modeling work could be even more, at least directly relevant. But by thinking, again, from the standards level, we feel like we can get a head start and also inform the actual specs. So one of the harms that could come out of the C2PA is a reduction in options for anonymity and pseudonymity. So we, based on how the specs are designed, we feel that for one thing, there is a possibility for people to inadvertently share sensitive information. And this refers back to questions around the user experience. So what if the specs have been designed to allow for confidentiality, but what if the user experience is not designed in such a way that it really allows the user to maintain control of that? And then there's also the questions around the fact that although the specs allow for confidentiality, they don't demand it. You could have compliant tooling that does require individual identifiers. And so that takes me actually to the second point, that the C2PA could result on attacks on journalistic freedoms and independence. So again, if the C2PA is abused in countries where there's no checks or control on government surveillance, and laws are enacted that require individual identifiers to be attached to manifests of images and videos published by journalists, then this could really have a negative impact on freedom of expression. And the third example here that I'll mention is requiring participation in the use of technology or surveillance to take part in society. So, for example, what if the C2PA is implemented in social media platforms, and further down the line, social media platforms decide that images and videos that contain manifest C2PA manifests or contain provenance information have a higher algorithmic ranking than those that don't, then there are questions about, well, what happens to those that, again, as I mentioned earlier, to those that decide for legitimate reasons that they do not want to use this provenance infrastructure, or that they can't because they just don't have access to it. So these three are just examples of the potential harms that have been identified. And then this is connected to some mitigation strategies, but there are others that there's still gaps that Witness and the C2PA are working on. And I'll actually, just in the interest of time, I'll skip these two slides which talk about more specific harms, and jump to this one right here. So all of this information that I have been sharing with you has been published alongside the specs. So if you visit the website c2pa.org and go into the specifications tab, you'll find that along with the actual specifications, there are a list of other documents that have been published with the specs. So one of them is the security considerations, one is user experience consideration, another is guidance for implementers, and there's the harms modeling work. And so in that harms modeling document, you'll find detailed information about the process that it was carried out. And you'll also find this table right here. This is just a snapshot of that table. And this includes all of the potential harms that have been identified. They've been categorized, they've been described, and with a contextual example, and then most importantly, perhaps tied to a specific existing and potential mitigation. So I'll end with this last slide right here on existing and potential mitigations. So the outputs of our harms modeling work. So based on the assessment and based on the potential harms that have been identified, what Witness has been doing as co-chairs of the Threat and Harms Task Force is to inform and shape these three areas of the C2PA. So first and most notoriously, the actual specifications, of course, so that the specifications in their design, they already include all of these considerations around privacy, accessibility, misuse, etc. The second area are the accompanying documents that I mentioned before. So based on this harm assessment, what does the user experience guidance need to include? So here, for example, we just emphasized on the need for there to be guidance for content creators, or also for consumers, but also for content creators to be able to know what information they're sharing and how the information is being shared, what the redaction mechanisms are, etc. What are the harms considerations that should be offered to implementers as they build these tools? And then another big one that Witness advocated for was an explainer. So very often these standards development groups are not necessarily very representative. So how could we get more people to know about what's happening, how we could get more input? And so to that end, an explainer has been drafted and published and is to be continuously updated. And then the third area that is affected by the work that Witness has been doing are the non-technical and multilateral harms response actions. So for one thing, as mentioned before, this includes thinking about resourcing and supporting a diverse C2PA ecosystem, right? So the specs have been designed. How do we now create the tools that actually human rights defenders will use in conflict zones? How do we create the tools that citizen journalists might use in countries where there might be a lot of government surveillance? We started to think about the governance of the C2PA. We're not steering committee members, so it's a tricky area, but mostly around questions around the red flags. What are the really compliance issues that we need to think about? Should they be addressed within the C2PA or beyond? We're thinking that this compliance should go beyond the C2PA, not part of the C2PA, but then how does that look like, or what does that look like? And then lastly, this ongoing assessment that I mentioned before. I hope that I've stayed within my time frame, Mallory, but I'll leave it open for if there are questions.
Thanks so much. Excellent presentation. We've got folks joining the queue. There were lots of really good questions in the chat, which I hope you weren't paying attention to as you presented, but why don't we go ahead and take Patrick in the remote queue, and then we've got a couple people at the mic. We can't hear the mic in the room. Need echo, folks.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Patrick Tarpey from Ofcom. It's a very interesting presentation. Thank you. Just a query here. Imagine a scenario, say, I don't know, 10 years in the future, and the metadata isn't available for a piece of content just to verify its provenance. Would we be looking at a situation, say, future researchers or people doing legal research or whatever, if it can't be verified, it then has a kind of like a secondary status in terms of the, and ultimately, who pays for that? I know I'm kind of combining two questions, but that's the, how will this sustain itself? I guess really, it's a great idea. Thank you.
Yeah. So this top two-tier issue is really one of the things that Witness has been thinking about, and then I believe your comment refers to legacy media, perhaps we could say. So what happens to the media that was created pre content authenticity and provenance? Yeah, there's questions around that. So in the design of the specs, there's something called an update manifest. So it is possible to include provenance information in work in digital assets that were created beforehand. Obviously, the information that would be contained within these manifests would say, well, this was created before. And then if you trust the signer, as I mentioned, this all revolves around the signer. If you trust the signer that created this manifest, then you might be tempted to say, okay, even though this was created after the moment, after the fact that the image was taken, I decide that I'll believe in it because it was signed by this signer that I choose to believe in. Even then, I think there's still issues that need to be addressed. And for us, one of the most concerning areas, one of the areas that we want to work on is not just for legacy media, but what happens to, again, people that for legitimate reasons cannot or do not want to use provenance information. And then the second question as to who pays for this, So the coalition is organized by these companies, and they're building these specifications. The actual tooling will depend on whoever wants to create these tools and be part of this ecosystem. And there, on that note, Witness is thinking, okay, well, how do we create tools for the people that we work with, for our constituents, human rights defenders, activists, and journalists? And there's a big question there too. And it's something that we'll hopefully work with the C2PA, but also beyond the C2PA.
Great. So Stefan, you were in front of me. Go ahead.
Stefan Bartsmeyer. I have a technical question, which may be actually a political one. When someone modify a picture with Photoshop, for instance, how are people supposed to verify the signatures? I mean, how do you get the public key of the person who modified, which is certainly the most difficult problem in cryptography? So is it covered by the specification, or?
How do you verify the identity of the signer? Is that the question?
No. How do I get the public key? The guy modifies the picture. He signs with his private key, I assume. So how do you get the public key to check the signature? And of course, how can you be sure that it's the correct public key? A typical hard problem.
So the specs, they're tied to they're connected to the use of certificate authorities that verify the identity of the signer. But on the public key aspect, to be honest, I can't tell you that. I don't work on the technical side of this, so I can't tell you. I'm sure there's a very easy answer to that, but I can't answer that.
Because it may turn into a big political problem, because who will issue the key, who will keep the keys, etc., etc.
I'm actually taking note of this, and hopefully I'll be able to answer this to you very shortly if I can reach out to you somehow. But
Thanks. And we can also drop the link to the version 1 spec, which is published, the white paper. I think that might be useful.
Yeah.
I put myself in the queue actually because I think I've heard a response for this before, but just wanted to verify if you are currently working, or other folks from the technical working group are currently working on standards. I think that there's an ISO group maybe that deals with image data that may be impacted by this design.
So if there's more folks that are working in other standards development organizations?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can't speak for what other people do really, but I know that the chair, Leonard Hofstadter, works in various standards development with JPEG, I believe. And then the IPTC, there's folks that have been working closely with IPTC. But yes, I know there are, but I can't mention specifically.
No worries. And actually the main question I compared this in my mental model to website certificate authorities or domain certificate authorities. And one of the stopgaps in abuse that we've seen enacted in the current Ukraine-Russia situation, for example, is certificate authorities not being recognized by the browsers. And that being, again, like a measure to ensure there's no abuse of the trust system. And it's maybe a comparable question to what Stefan just asked, which is, what would be the equivalent then of, say, a C2PA certificate authority issuing assurances was doing so in bad faith? Like, how do you kind of stop those verifications from entering into the ecosystem? Like, is it through the software developers that are implementing it? Is it through the publishers who are publishing it? Is there, how does that work? Or do you have to be part of the coalition to be able to be a CA? Just wondering.
No, so the specifications have a segment on trust lists, and there's not much guidance on trust lists, because once you start creating parameters for what's trusted and what's not, then it opens a can of worms. And then considering that this has so many uses in so many different industries, then it's hard to define who is accepted and who's not part of this trust list. So all it says in terms of guidance to that end is that claim generators, so these those that create these manifests, maintain certain trust lists of certificate authorities that they work with and that they accept for signing these manifests. I don't know if that answers the question, Mallory.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's something maybe to be further explored, because I do think that there's, on the one hand, like the trust, which could be about content, it could be about identity, like that's kind of a thorny issue that's harder to resolve. But then there's the issue of like, if you've got an actor in your space who is acting in bad faith or not, doing the right thing, I mean, that should also be actionable, right? So that entity is no longer sort of accepted in the ecosystem. And so anyway, that's it's a difficult one for sure, but I think that'll probably need to be addressed at some point.
Yeah, and that speaks to the compliance issues that we've been thinking about.
Yeah.
And we're very open to
Compliance. There you go.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Nick.
Hi, Nick Doty, Center for Democracy and Technology. Thank you so much for this presentation. I have lots of questions that I'm not going to I'll ask right now. I'm kind of curious just about this more sort of process thing, including this slide that you're showing right now. I really like this idea of using explainers of the idea that not everyone is going to understand all of the specifications, or not everyone is going to be able to participate. That's just a fact at the moment. And that's something we also face with IETF and W3C, other technical standards bodies. And so I am curious about this idea of explainers, and I would just be curious to hear if you've heard from people who have used those explainers, or other groups that were interested but weren't actively participating. Have you gotten any feedback about, oh, because of the explainer, I understood how this worked, or I had this question, or I had this concern? Do you have any examples of how those have gotten used?
Yeah, so first, I think I'm not sure where the idea of explainer came from. I don't know if this is standard. I actually would love to know if creating explainers is standard within a standards development organization. But at least the idea of it is tied to much of the work that many of you may be involved with, and the notion that SDOs are not very representative. So with that context, the idea of creating an explainer was very important from witnesses' perspective, and the way that the explainer is drafted, and it's something that you could check. It's hopefully very very open and very accessible to the general public, to people that have no idea about SDOs and have no technical background whatsoever. So that is the way that it has been drafted. Hopefully that's the way that it's been read. When we present the C2PA to folks that are not part of these environments, they have pointed to the explainer to say, because we read the explainer, we get a better sense of what this is for sure. The fact is, when you look at the specs, it's just very, very overwhelming. It's very, very technical, and definitely not, it doesn't invite people to comment on them. And the explainer has been, and we've had several people mention that, Nick, that this is their access to these discussions.
That's like really admirable, and I'm kind of excited that you do have at least some positive feedback. Maybe we can try that in some other settings to have that more human readable version.
Excellent. Thank you again so much for joining us. It was really nice to hear about this, and I'm glad you brought it to HRPC for folks to reflect on. So you can always contact each other if anybody has questions on the mailing list or through email. So I encourage folks that still have lingering questions to do that. So thanks again for joining us. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. I will not pull up the agenda again. If I remember correctly, we have the draft guidelines to present. So Gershabad, if you are ready, you can come on up virtually.
Okay.
Are you able to load your slides, or would you like me to control them? Okay, good. Thanks.
Perfect. And if someone can help take notes during this part, that would be great. So yeah, this is a quick update on where draft guidelines is. So just to recap for folks who haven't, who don't know about the document, it's an update to RFC 8280, which talked about generally guidelines for assessing how a protocol or specification affects human rights. And this is updating the guidelines part in that document. And we hope that so it is based on practice in the sense that we've had some practical experience, like people applying and assessing standards with these guidelines and helping us improve them. And it's also written in a way that you can, hopefully you can easily use them to ask questions of the protocol that you're designing or assessing. Currently, the document is at its 12th version. After the last meeting, the two major things have been that it was moved from last call to IETF chair review, which happened. Thanks, Colin, for the detailed review. This feedback was addressed in January, and you may see some changes in the structure. The sections have been reordered, and the changes are too changes in the content are too numerous to detail now. But if you like that list, I can send a link in the chat where I mean, at least the list, not a summary. So now I get to the part where I'm stating mostly my opinion of how I see things. So I think we've addressed most of the feedback that has come on the list. There is one part that may still seem a bit controversial, which is the section on attribution. My personal assessment is that we've had some requests of making minor changes to that section, but I think we've labored it on quite so long that I don't see any serious objection to it, but any modification invites serious objection. So I'm quite happy with what the current text is, which is that it's advising against attribution in protocols. It's saying that overall, privacy, security, and censorship resistance, and anonymity and pseudonymity are values in conflict with attribution, and it's advising against it for now. So personally, I would suggest not making any further changes to this section. Yeah, so for now, I actually would love to hear from Mallory, or if Colin is in the room as well, what the next steps are. And Niels, if I missed anything, please do step on the mic and add it.
Great, thanks, Gershabad. Go ahead.
I'm not sure I can do this through the medium of interpretive dance like Niels did, thank you for updating the draft and taking my concerns into account. I see you've put a lot of effort into this, and there's been a lot of changes made, and I do appreciate the work you put in here. Sorry, I'm just trying to juggle windows here. I mean, for the comments on remedy and attribution, which I think you mentioned on your previous slide. I mean, this is clearly an area where there's been some difficulty reaching consensus in the group. I'm certainly not a human rights expert, and I don't understand the legal aspects here, so I'm not going to push hard on this. As a protocol designer, though, I sort of struggle to see what that section is getting at. I don't know if, I suggested an example as a way of helping me understand what that meant, and maybe that's difficult to provide, and maybe there's some other clarification that might be possible, and maybe we just have to accept that section is just it's just going to be as it is, and if the group it does have consensus that this is the best it can get, then I'm happy to go with that. But that was my real concern there. I don't know if that makes sense.
Thanks. If I may just quickly respond, I think that again, remedy and attribution are part of the human rights framework. They find mention in the guiding principles for business and human rights as well. So I think John Curran specifically pointed this out. That's where the section also came from, that perhaps it's not the best decision to just shy away from it and to include it and discuss the trade-offs. In this particular case, like when it comes to designing protocols, and I also think I would say, like, largely, if I get the consensus right, is that having an element in the protocol that provides attribution is overall against the other values we're discussing of privacy, security. And there's so much on that side of privacy, security, anonymity, pseudonymity, that attribute is, and what we say here is that attribution is probably against. Like, so it's not important to include this considering the other factors. That's this consensus I sense on the group. I think in favor of including this at all was the fact that it is in those documents and we shouldn't shy away from mentioning it. But I think it accurately represents the consensus. I think that making any other changes would, I mean, we've discussed this like 4 or 5 times now. I don't know if any better solution is possible. So but yeah, Valerie, if you think like I'm, or Sophia, if you think I'm not capturing the consensus well, please let me know as well.
No, I mean, my impression, and obviously, it's from Mallory and Sophia to judge the consensus, but my impression is that you are judging the consensus correctly. My comment was much more of I'm not sure I understand as a protocol designer what this section means to me. And I think it sort of ties a little bit into the sort of broader comments I had about the interpretation of the rights, and how, I made a comment about how the rights interpreted differently in different parts of the world. And I get the idea that the authors have a particular view of how to interpret the various rights, and have some understanding of what's meant by these various concerns. But as someone who is coming to this who is not a human rights expert, and to the extent I see human rights discussed, it's in the context of the national laws and the regulations I need to apply to. It's hard for me to necessarily understand what you're meaning by some of these rights. And my comment about trying to give some examples was not because I wanted an exhaustive discussion of how different countries do it. It was just because I was finding it hard to relate the quite abstract discussion into concrete principles that I need to apply when I'm building a protocol or designing a system. And I think this section is one of those where that's especially an issue.
Understood. So to go in sequence, I think the first part on attribution, in terms of practical guidance, it means don't consider it. Like, there's no need to. That's that's my reading of it. Like, don't consider attribution while designing it because it goes against the other values discussed in the document. On the second part, I fully understand what you mean. I think yeah.
Slightly more basically, tell me what you mean by attribution and what you mean by remedy before you then go into that discussion.
So I've pasted the text in the chat because I think sometimes it gets lost where this appears. Why in a human rights document will we be talking about attribution? It's because there is a right to remedy. So that means you sort of give people some recourse to harms. And one way that you might do that is through attribution. But you wouldn't necessarily, so that's a balance. So once you are faced with two rights that might come into conflict with one another, there's got to be some kind of balancing act. And so in the context of a protocol, because of the greater disproportionate harm of attribution, even though it might give an individual a right to remedy, it would potentially place like disproportionate harm on all users because of that additional identifier, and that would violate both rights to privacy and security for most people for the remedy of one. So that's where it's situated in that section, and I think otherwise it wouldn't come up because I don't think there's no like right to attribution. That's a sort of, that would be not included in here, but it's related to the right to remedy. So it's actually kind of minor. In the grand scheme of things, it's really not, it doesn't feature that large. And so I wonder if there would be text that maybe better explains that. I mean, I think the amount of text that's there now seems to fit with, you know, the sort of tone of the rest of the thing. But if there's maybe a, because it also links, I'm looking at the references in that text. They're a bit vague, so it could be that we could bring forward some text from the David K. Reference, maybe one sentence, or we could just leave it as is because I think that reference would probably explain it better. But anyway, point taken. Yeah,
it's just, you know, this is written from the point of view of a set of authors who have a clear understanding of what these rights mean and how they believe they're interpreted. I'm just not sure the protocol designers reading it have that context and that background, and that's where I'm struggling with it in places. And there's a bunch of technical nuance which we can follow up on the list, and I think that's been, you know, greatly improved. And you know, I apologize, I haven't had time to go through all the details of that, but I will follow up on the technical things. But you know, conceptually, it's just make sure the context and how the rights are interpreted, what those rights are, is a little clearer for people who don't have the background in human rights.
And so for next steps, Colin, I think that it would be good to have your sort of re-review and make sure that there aren't any other outstanding issues. Because as far as I understand as well, from my perspective as sort of the Doc Shepherd chair, and it seems to me that that was the sort of last sticking point. And then I think everything else has been resolved. But that depends on you and whether or not this draft would progress quickly thereafter.
Yeah, I do have some technical comments. I haven't had a chance to write them up properly, but it's certainly going in the right direction, and it's you know, the changes made are a big improvement, I think. But yeah, I will try and review it carefully in the next few weeks.
Thanks a lot. Great. Sophia, any other comments? Anyone else? Oh, sorry.
I was going to say the same as you, Mallory, and I was thinking maybe the same as making the reference clear, or maybe moving it a little bit somewhere so it's more clear prior to just say using attribution in the text rather just maybe moving it a little bit further. Yeah.
So
I think I look at that.
Yes, no, perfect. Noted. So we'll work on that and push an update to the remedy section, and Colin, look forward to your other feedback. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks very much, Gershabad and Niels. Niels, I'm going to ask you to come in. You're going to present on, I think, on draft association.
Here we go. Talking about draft association, me, Gisela Perez de Acha, Stefan Couture, Mallory, we've all been working on this to expand and deepen the relationship between specific rights and protocols. That's the second part of our charter, so trying to implement that. What we're not trying to do explicitly is analyze specific protocols for their human rights impact or produce new guidelines, because new guidelines were in the document that we discussed before, and analyzing specific protocols is what we're doing in impact assessments. So what we've been working on is that we've been working on this for 5 years now. So we have a little birthday of this draft. Excellent. So this has been an RG document for 3.5 years with authors from academia, civil society in different geographies and disciplines. And now we've had a review and a new doc shepherd that we've been waiting for a while. Welcome, Nick. Thanks so much for agreeing to be the document shepherd. That is excellent. So what happened since 07? We've added definitions. The abstract has been cleaned up and added conclusions as suggested by Nick. We removed explanation and methodology from RFC 8280 to make things less messy. Many NITs, many language things where you can also see the different geographies and the different mother tongues that were not English shine through in the text. Sorry about all the Dutchisms and all that, and then Spanglish, and yeah, it was a beautiful thing. But now more a bit better grammar, a bit better language, better language on accessibility, added emphasis that a document is about human rights as per the Hrpc Charter and not implementation in national laws. That could definitely be another document, but we've talked about this before. What could be done for 10 is work together with the shepherd, of course, because based on the shepherd's review, I produced a new review. So happy to discuss with the shepherd what could be done, but what I think that could have more work is clearer connect the case studies, clearer connect the questions that arise from the literature review to the case studies, because that is the direction we went on and we try to fill in. That is not necessarily as strong as it can, so perhaps we should make that stronger, but happy to work on that with the document shepherd and follow the document shepherds and the chairs and the RG's opinion on that. So that's where we are.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Niels. Any comments on that? I mean, I'm an author, so I think with the author hat on, I'm really grateful for the review from Nick, because I think it's made the document much stronger. And we've already been, yeah, okay, Nick, go ahead.
I don't want to interrupt you, Mallory.
My thought was not fully complete, so I'm grateful for the interruption.
Okay, great. Thanks, Niels, for the very quick summary, and I know we're short on time, so I won't go into depth right now. Thanks for doing those very quick responses, and I'm certainly happy to help with those steps. I think that's a reasonable plan for what our next step should be. I think there probably are still some more edits we can make, and I do like trying to make those clear connections between both the lit review, which is something that's useful out of the document, and the direct cases. And then I'm sort of curious for the chairs and for the research group as a whole. It seems like we have been talking about this document for a long time. Once we've done those edits, maybe we're ready for a last call, and then as shepherd, I would just try to help us with any last comments we get from going through that process.
It seems to me as well that would be the next step, because I feel that sort of once we did the redesign, and I can't remember if it was a year ago or 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, the sort of reworking of the whole thing, it's really flowed quite smoothly from that point forward. So I wouldn't think there would be a lot of hang up after we smooth that out. But we'll see. All right, let's take it to the list. So yeah, Lenny, I would love to invite you up because we have 10 minutes left. I'm sorry you didn't get your full 15, but just really glad to have you here to talk about a draft that I know you've presented elsewhere as well. So yeah, welcome. And are you able to, I don't know if you have slides or if you'd just like to.
I do. Sorry, I didn't submit them to you, did I?
That's okay. You might be able to just screen share in the interest of time then.
Yes. Which button is that?
It's the middle one. Okay, that should work maybe.
No, wrong button.
There you are.
Okay, how about that?
Yep, we can see it. Thanks.
Great. So going to briefly go through a recent draft on considerations for regional internet blocking. This was presented at IEPEG and INT area, and given some of the overlapping themes, thought it might be interesting to present here and get some of the feedback of the folks in this group. To start with disclaimers, this is the content is solely the views and ideas of the authors and doesn't reflect those of any of the organizations with which we are affiliated. Also, to be very clear, this was it's kind of obvious for those familiar with IETF, but it was requested that we mention this because there may be folks who are less familiar with IETF processes. This is an individual contribution and does not reflect IETF consensus. All right, so moving along. Let's start with the motivation of the draft. So, you know, in light of recent events, there have been discussions of internet sanctioning or blocking internet connectivity for a region or a nation. What we wanted to do is basically describe what that would look like, describe some well-known approaches for blocking connectivity and what are the implications, what would be the positive, the negative, the advantages, the disadvantages, some of the consequences intended and unintended. Kind of our audience, the intended audience is policymakers and the general public at large. The idea is, in order to have a good policy, depends upon good, unbiased information. So our goal is to describe, kind of try to stay in our swim lanes as engineers, for folks who may be considering this kind of policy, explain what it would look like, how it would work technically, would it, and talk about some of the intended and unintended consequences, as well as, you know, efficacy. What this document is not is advocacy for or against any particular policy. It is not political opinion. We don't go into the ethics of blocking. Also, obviously, there's, you know, an obvious event episode, geopolitical episode going on right now that kind of inspired this, but our goal is to make it generic enough that it would be applicable to future events as well, and not just one singular event. Also, this is not about blocking against security threats coming out of a region, but more like, you know, what would happen if one wanted to do the equivalent of, you know, economic sanctions for the internet, connectivity sanctions. It's also not a how-to guide on weaponizing the internet or exposing industry secrets or seeding the minds of folks with novel approaches to fragmenting the internet. We limited this to just well-known approaches that operators use for legitimate blocking purposes, and what if they use these well-known approaches to attempt to block an entire country or region. We also didn't go into malicious attacks. It's an interesting topic, probably worth its own document, but it was just too broad of a topic and something that was outside the expertise of the author, so we left that out of scope. So with that out of the way, the meat of the document, the blocking techniques, we started kind of at the physical layer and worked our way up. These are, again, nothing groundbreaking, nothing secret, disconnecting cables, what that would do, what that would look like, the advantages and disadvantages of that approach. Moving on up to the control plane, the routing layer, de-peering in BGP, as well as BGP route filtering, prefix-based or ASN-based. Then moving along to data plane, packet layer filtering, things like geo-IP access control lists, what they do, what they don't do, some of the challenges. And then DNS, things like undelegating top-level domains and other domains could be one approach, as well as blocking resolution requests from resolving name servers or end hosts within a region. Again, nothing really, these are pretty pedestrian approaches that are pretty well understood by the types of people who attend IETF. But the idea is about educating those who don't and who might want to know and might want to understand what are the challenge, what are some of the options, and what are the technical implications of each of these. Next, we went into the gaps of efficacy. So, for example, connectivity sanctioning by a policymaker may actually be counterproductive to the aims of the policymaker. For example, the policymaker might want messages to get into and out of a region, and blocking would hinder that. They may want certain parties, say, for example, opposition groups within the targeted region. They might want them to freely communicate and coordinate activities, and hindering connectivity would obviously hinder that. Also, blocking connectivity may actually empower a party that is targeted for sanction. It could allow, for example, a regime that is targeted to actually consolidate its power and prevent alternative messaging from being accessed. The network, again, doesn't discriminate between good and bad bits. It just transmits bits, whether they form good or bad messages. Other challenges to be aware, things to be aware of. ASNs and prefixes are not allocated based on geopolitical boundaries. They're roughly allocated based on region. But over time, for example, an organization within a country, it's fairly easy to see all the assignments, ASN or route assignments to entities within a region, but those entities may be, say, acquired by larger multinational organizations, and those announcements those BGP ASN announcements or prefix announcements could appear in different regions over time. Also, registry information is notoriously inaccurate. Finally, the internet is decentralized by design, making it pretty much impossible to completely block a region. That's a feature, not a bug. But it's worth noting that connectivity and throughput can be inhibited at certain choke points. There is some related.
Lenny, we have about 1 minute left, so we want to make sure there are comments. But go ahead and wrap up.
Gotcha. Related work. RFC 7754 focuses more on higher level issues than blocking routing infrastructure. Also, its focus is a little bit different, not so much sanction, but there are overlapping themes. And there's the censorship document, which I'm sure folks in this group are more than aware of. Again, it's a different focus, but there is some overlap. In terms of next steps, we presented this at Interia and requested adoption. It was determined that consensus there was not consensus to adopt it. But the question we had was, is this a useful document? Is this worth pursuing? We'd love further comments and review. Lots more to say, but I'll open it up for questions.
Yes, anyone needs to join the queue, get on mic, that'd be preferable. I want to just point out Nick's comment in the chat, which I would agree with as author of, or one of the co-authors, late coming co-authors of the censorship draft in Pair G on section 5.3.2 of that document. Feels like if there are improvements that could be made to that section based on what you've documented in yours, we'd really welcome that. And Niels, go ahead, and then followed by Stefan in the room. Go ahead, Niels.
Thanks for the work and thanks for presenting it. I think that if you want to reach the general audience, RFCs might be the worst place to work. From experience, I try to get people to read them, even students, and they're just, so it might not be the best place if you want to do that. And the work on draft censorship has been going on for such a long time, and it would be really great to not start. There was a reason it took very long, and that's why we get it there. So it would be really great if we could make it part of that and not do another process of that. So I really hope that you consider that and contributing to that work.
Sure, thanks for the feedback. Our goal was to make it a nice short document that might be consumable by the general public. Yeah, thanks for the suggestion.
Go ahead.
I think that the document is useful. I agree with Niels that it would be, if in order to outreach the general public, something from ISOC, for instance, would be probably better, but it's not a problem. I mean, it can be two different work, one at the IETF, focused on technical precision, and one at ISOC, focused on explaining to the general public. There is one thing missing maybe in the document, is that disconnecting from the internet, it depends on what you call the internet. I mean, it's not something you subscribe to when you are a country. You have also a lot of internal connection and service, and so it maybe deserves some discussion about what does it mean exactly to be cut from the internet. You are cut not from the internet, you are cut from other countries, which may or may not be equivalent. Imagine sanctions against the United States, and can we disconnect the United States from the internet? That would be an interesting thought experiment.
Yeah, so it was brought up that ISOC does have a position on this and has articulated that pretty eloquently, and other organizations have as well. ICANN, I've seen. Again, we're trying to do something a little different, which is not advocate one thing or another. That's, what we're trying to do is describe what it would look like so that those who do advocate can do so with good, sober technical information. We feel it's kind of, the more appropriate for, engineers to say, if you're thinking about doing this, we're not going to say if this is a good or a bad idea, but if you are thinking about this, here's what you should know so that you can decide yourself, is this a good or bad idea? So that's kind of the goal. And it's just a question of, is there a consensus within IETF to actually do that? In terms of the mention about there is a section on porous borders that I think tries to capture what you described, the challenges that, it's really not easy to just disconnect a country, and what that means. Again, these things are obvious to people who are familiar with the internet and come to IETF, but maybe, to the layperson, not so much. And hopefully that they could find that useful information.
So yeah, I joined the queue as chair, just in response to the chat. If there's interest here in this draft, since it didn't seem that Inter-Area would progress with it. And I think both Sophia and I are on the same page that we're not in favor of adopting it here, but it has been an important discussion on the list. And so we welcome that and are glad that you came to present it here, because I do think it's been useful for folks that have a history with working on draft censorship, which isn't even in this working group. So I think the research group, I think the action would probably be to follow up with a message to the privacy research group list about this draft to see if there's further discussion or interest from the research group in adopting some of the text in the censorship draft, although that draft is probably going to next call soon. But that, again, happy to have had you discuss here, since it followed on from such a strong discussion on the list, but, and thanks again for that. We have a few more folks in the queue, and I'm willing to keep going over time as long as Midako.
Mallory, I shut down my PC already, so I could not join the queue.
It's
So
okay,
just
go ahead.
reply to you, Stefan. My name is Eric Vink. I am also the Inter-Area Director. And just to mention again that Andrew Sullivan from ISOC and Society has published a nice paper 2 weeks ago, something, which is more on the political aspect, and it's really well written. That's what I need to say. Thank you.
I agree.
Continue the queue.
Yeah.
Okay. Go, Elliot.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to people. This is an interesting draft. Thanks to the authors for writing things down. And what I was going to say, Lenny and Tony, is I think we should find a home for it. But it seems to me like it's a good idea to expand some of. I think this is a good start, right? I suspect that there's a fair amount more elaboration, and maybe a bit more discussion on goals. Not to say, not to wade into what goal is good versus what goal is bad, but what goals can be achieved, just to be a little crisper in the draft around that, and then to examine each of the mechanisms that you talk about just a little bit more crisply in that regard. And I think you would find, I think actually what that will lead people to, I think, likely very good conclusions from my own political perspective, because this is obviously a field fraught with landmines, if you will, in the intellectual sense. So I do appreciate the work, and I look forward to seeing it continue somewhere. I just hope that it can find a right home.
Thank you. And yeah, like I said, we tried to balance it with keeping things at a high level. Again, we didn't want to plant seeds and give people ideas. And also we want to make it readable. A 50-page document is probably not going to be, readable to the audience that we were hoping for. And we didn't want to just kind of live in an echo chamber within IETF of people who already know this stuff. But more as a work that the people who do know this stuff want the people who don't know this kind of stuff to know and understand, so that they can come to better informed decisions.
Yeah, just briefly bringing forward some discussion from Inter-Area yesterday, just felt that it wasn't a great representation of IETF's mandate to keep everything connected. So it would obviously be useful for folks who missed that. You can watch it on YouTube as well. Anyway, Ben, you're the last one in the queue. Go right ahead.
Thanks, Ben Schwartz. So having had some more time to think about this draft, I think that the best way to make it more useful would be to change the intended audience. I don't think that IETF documents are an effective way to speak to effectively governments and policymakers, which in my view is the implicit audience here, because this is about, it's phrased in terms of countries, and so we're talking about actions that countries take relative to each other. I think that's not an audience that the IETF can reach very effectively, and I think that we have a real risk of miscommunication if we try to reach for that audience. I think that what might be more productive here would be to focus on the audience we can reach, which is technical service operators. And I think there's a really interesting question in there that you are close to addressing, which is as an individual service operator, maybe an authoritative DNS service operator, maybe a peering provider. Under what circumstances, what should my considerations be when I'm thinking about ceasing to do business with somebody? What are some reasons why? What are some goals that I might be able to achieve by deciding that I'm no longer willing to, for example, peer with another AS? And what are some goals that I'm not going to be able to achieve that way?
Yeah, that's interesting feedback. Tony and Melchior and I are trying to reassess what would be the best next steps. I'm personally of the belief that it would be good if the IETF produced documents that aren't just to be consumed by those preaching to the choir who are only in IETF, and I think the organization would be more effective, and maybe the world would be a better place if our documents were more consumable by the general public who are interested in learning and understanding about such a vital technology. But I mean, that's a fair point that it is challenging, and the idea of writing something for operators, that's an interesting idea that I know that the other Tony, Mel, and I will definitely consider. So thank you.
Thanks again.
We'd welcome any other comments on the list or emails to the authors. We'd be happy to hear any other feedback and ideas. We're kind of open to anything.
Great.
Thank you, Mallory.
Yep. Thanks so much. Thanks to the note takers for today's meeting. Thanks to everybody who participated by joining the queue and in the chat. Really had a great session, and sorry we ran out of time. Thanks to the MeetEcho folks and the people in the room who stuck around for us. So that's it. This concludes 113 for HRPC, and see you next time, and see you on the list.